The sun had not yet cleared the ridge of the low hills to the east, but already the air shimmered faintly with heat. Dawn on the Arizona prairie was never gentle. The day rose with a pale, pitiless light that promised neither shade nor mercy. From her kitchen window, Eliza Carter could see the scrub stretching for miles, interrupted only by the jagged silhouettes of mesquite trees and the occasional dry gulch. This land was both her enemy and her home, and she had learned sometimes unwillingly to endure it. Her small homestead sat like a stubborn knot in the middle of the plain, a single-story structure of rough pine boards bleached gray by sun and wind. The roof sagged slightly on one side from last year's dust storm, but Eliza saw no point in fretting over it. A woman alone on the frontier had to choose her battles. And lately, most of her battles were fought with the soil persuading it to give up a little corn, a few beans, anything that could keep her and her baby fed until autumn dot inside. The air was warmer than she would have liked, but the smell of bread baking in the Dutch oven comforted her. She had risen before the first light to tend the fire and prepare breakfast. Her son Samuel still nursed at her breast, barely 9 months old, sturdy for his age but needy in that relentless way babies were. She had learned to do everything one-handed: stoke a fire, peel potatoes, even haul water from the well, all while holding the child against her hip. It had been 3 years since Henry, her husband, had gone out with a wagon train and never returned. No one knew for certain what had happened, though whispers traveled faster than truth on the prairie. Some said the Apaches had taken him, others claimed bandits, and a few suggested he'd simply gone to California and started a new life without her. Eliza didn't care for any of the stories. She carried her loss quietly, like a stone in her apron pocket, something she could never set down, but had learned not to take out and examine too often. The morning chores were always the same: feed the chickens, check the goats, draw water, inspect the small patch of garden for pests or damage. The goats, at least, were thriving. Eliza had coaxed them through 2 harsh winters and took quiet pride in their survival. As she poured grain into the trough, Samuel fussed in his sling, squirming against her shoulder. She patted his back and hummed a tune her mother used to sing in the green hills of Missouri. Strange how that memory felt like another lifetime entirely. The air was dry, but in the distance she saw a shimmer along the edge of the horizon, a trick of the heat, she thought at first. The wind was still, so there was no dust cloud to suggest riders. Yet something about the way the light shifted made her pause. She shaded her eyes with one hand. The prairie had taught her that a figure could be nothing more than a stubborn fence post, or it could be a stranger walking straight toward her. And strangers, in this land, were never a simple matter. She squinted. Yes, there was movement. A shape, perhaps two, slowly resolving in the glare of the rising sun. Whoever it was, they were coming on foot. And one of them, if her eyes did not deceive her, was carrying something cradled in their arms. Her stomach tightened. She told herself it could be a neighbor from 10 miles off, though she knew few would walk that far. Still, she did not go for the rifle. Not yet. The baby at her breast reminded her that fear should always be tempered with patience. One could not live long out here jumping at every shadow. She finished with the goats, then stepped onto the porch, the boards warm already beneath her bare feet. She waited, letting the shapes grow clearer. Her heart ticked faster when she saw the glint of a headband, the long black hair loose over dark shoulders, and the unmistakable cut of a buckskin shirt. An Apache. The word alone carried weight. In her mind, it was not hatred, though the wariness born of countless frontier stories was there. It was the knowledge that their worlds rarely crossed in peace. She had heard of Apaches moving silently through the night, striking and vanishing before a single lantern could be lit. She had also heard of their dignity, their fierce protection of kin. Which stories were true, she did not know. The figure drew nearer, and now she could see the child in his arms, wrapped in a faded deerskin bundle, small enough to be swallowed by it entirely. The man's pace was uneven, his shoulders hunched, as though he carried not just the baby, but a weight heavier than the desert sun. Eliza's hands tightened on the porch railing. She was alone, except for her son. The sensible thing might have been to step inside, bolt the door, and wait for him to pass. But she did not move. Something in the way he held the bundle gently, carefully, desperately rooted her to the spot. The bread in her oven was beginning to burn. She smelled the faint bitterness of overdone crust, but she did not turn back inside. The Apache was now close enough that she could see his eyes, dark, rimmed with fatigue, fixed entirely on her. She realized with a jolt of surprise that whatever errand had brought him here, it was not war. It was need. The man stopped just beyond the crude split-rail fence that marked the edge of Eliza's homestead. He did not speak at once. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two people from worlds that had little reason to meet, each measuring the other in the silence. Up close, Eliza could see how worn he was. Dust clung to his leggings and boots, a pale crust along the seams. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched taut over high cheekbones, and his lips were dry, cracked in places. The headband around his brow was stained with sweat, its once bright colors dulled to the shade of old clay. But it was the baby in his arms that caught her attention most. The child's skin was a sickly gray-brown under the dust, the eyelids heavy, the mouth slack. Every so often, a faint whimper escaped, more a sigh than a cry, as though even distress had become too tiring. The bundle of deerskin was drawn tightly, but Eliza could tell by the thinness of the little arms and the sharp line of the jaw that this child had not fed well in days. The warrior, though she did not doubt that, was what he was, shifted his stance and raised his chin slightly, as if bracing for her reaction. He held the child out a little, not offering exactly, but showing. Eliza glanced instinctively toward the door where her own son lay napping in his cradle, then back at the man. Her pulse had quickened, but not entirely from fear. There was something raw in the way he stood there, something that cut through the barriers between them faster than any words could. When he spoke, the words were low and careful. She could not understand them. The Apache language rolled like stones in a river, full of sounds she had never heard before. But the meaning came clear enough in the way he gestured to the child, then pointed to her, then mimed bringing something to his mouth. Milk. She took a step forward, still on her side of the fence. The baby's head rolled slightly as the man adjusted his hold, and she saw the tiny lips part, searching weakly. Eliza had not been asked for much since Henry's death. Neighbors helped when they could, but most people kept to themselves. And yet here was this stranger, an Apache no less, standing in the glare of the morning sun, asking for the one thing she had that could not be bought or traded. Something she could only give. Her mind, quick as it was, still flinched through the practical dangers. What if others were near, waiting to see how she responded? What if this was some trick to get her to drop her guard? What if he meant to take more than milk? But the baby's shallow breathing, the thin rise and fall of that small chest, pressed on her harder than the what-ifs. She thought of Samuel in the first weeks after his birth, how helpless he had been. If someone had turned them away then. She shuddered at the thought. She stepped down from the porch and crossed the yard slowly. The man's eyes followed her every movement. His hand tightened on the child as she drew close, but he did not move away. When she was near enough to see the fine dust in the baby's eyelashes, she held out her arms. The warrior hesitated. There was a flicker in his gaze, uncertainty, maybe even mistrust, but it passed. With great care, he placed the small bundle into her hands. The child was lighter than she expected. She could feel the bony angles beneath the wrappings, the faint heat of fever. The smell of travel clung to the little one. sun-warmed leather, dry earth, and something faintly sweet, like wilted mesquite blossoms. Eliza looked up at the man, then toward the house. Without speaking, she nodded toward her door. His gaze followed, but he did not move to follow her. Instead, he remained by the fence, one hand resting on the top rail, his shoulders straight but his eyes watchful. She turned toward the house, the baby in her arms, and crossed the threshold. The cool dimness inside felt like a blessing. Samuel stirred in his cradle at the sound of her footsteps. She sat in her rocker, unfastened the buttons of her dress, and drew the stranger's child to her breast. The baby latched weakly at first, then with sudden hunger. Eliza could feel the pull, the tiny hands pressing against her as though clinging to life itself. A low sound rose from the infant's throat, half gulp, half sigh, and she felt an odd tightness in her chest, something both painful and relieving. Through the open door, she saw the warrior still at the fence, standing like a sentry. He had not moved, but his head was slightly bowed, his gaze fixed on them. She wondered, in that moment, if this was the first time since the child's mother had died that he had seen the baby truly fed. And without knowing his name, or he hers, something passed between them that was deeper than language, an understanding that for now she would give what the child needed, and he would trust her to do so. The sound of the baby's feeding slowed as the little one's hunger began to ease. Eliza shifted slightly in her chair, supporting the child's head in the crook of her arm, and glanced toward the open doorway. The Apache still stood at the fence. His posture was straight, but there was a strange stillness about him, like a man holding back the urge to step forward. She thought perhaps he feared crossing into her space, knew that her home, in a land this wild, was her fortress, and that a stranger crossing its threshold without invitation could spark something neither of them wanted. The baby released her, breast for a moment, made a small sound, half cough, half whimper, then settled again. Eliza reached for the cup of water she kept nearby, sipping slowly as she studied the man outside. Her mind circled the same questions. Who was he? How far had he come? And why, with all the risks of approaching a white settler's home, had he chosen hers? When the baby finished nursing, Eliza wrapped him more securely in the deerskin and carried him back outside. The sun was higher now, washing the yard in a hard white light. The Apache's eyes flicked to the bundle instantly. She walked toward the fence, stopping a few paces short. The man stepped forward until they faced each other with only the rails between them. She offered the child out. He took him, cradling him close in a way that surprised her. A warrior's hands could be gentle, it seemed, when it came to something this small. The baby made a soft, contented sound and rested against his chest. Eliza noticed the change in the man's face then. The tightness in his jaw eased, and the lines of worry softened. He murmured something low and rhythmic in his own language, the syllables flowing like water. He looked at her again, and this time his gestures were deliberate. First he touched his chest. Then he tapped the baby's head gently. Next, he swept his hand toward the horizon, making a small circle in the air as though pointing to a place far away. Finally, he mimed the act of drinking. She pieced it together. Slowly, this was not a one-time visit. He needed her help, not just for today, but for as long as the baby could not survive without milk. The thought lodged in her chest like a pebble. The man was asking her to become part of this child's survival, to give something of herself each day until they could move on. Eliza glanced at Samuel's cradle inside the house, visible through the open door. Nursing two infants, her own and another's, would not be easy. It would drain her strength, stretch her food supply, and invite questions from neighbors that she did not care to answer. But when her eyes fell on the baby again, she knew her choice was already made. She nodded once, slow but certain. The man exhaled in a way that almost sounded like relief. Still, she had one condition, not in words, but in the language of hands and eyes. She pointed to the far side of the fence, then to the shade of the mesquite tree near the edge of her yard. She mimed him waiting there when he came, not crossing the fence without her say dash so. His gaze followed her gestures, and after a moment he gave a short nod. Agreement. The next gesture he made surprised her. He laid his palm flat against his own chest, then against the baby's, then extended that hand toward her. It was not a demand, not even quite an offering. It was a bridge. She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her own hand briefly against his. His skin was warm, rough with the calluses of someone who had known labor and hardship. For the span of that touch, she felt something like a silent promise pass between them. Without further words, he turned and began to walk toward the mesquite's shade, settling there with the baby against him. Eliza returned inside, her thoughts turning to how she would explain this, if she even should, to anyone who asked. She checked the bread in the oven, its crust now firm and dark but still edible. She cut a slice for herself, then another for him. By the time she stepped outside again, the baby was sleeping in his arms, and the man accepted the bread with a nod of gratitude. He ate slowly, his eyes never leaving the child. And in that quiet, with only the wind in the grass and the distant call of a hawk, Eliza realized that though they had not spoken a single shared word, they had already agreed on something far more binding than a conversation. They would meet again tomorrow. That night, the prairie was restless. The wind moved in sudden bursts, rattling the shutters and setting the rafters to creak. Eliza sat at her small table after Samuel had gone down to sleep, staring at the stub of a candle burning low. The Apache's face kept returning to her mind, not fierce, not threatening, but lined with exhaustion and something sharper, desperation. And behind that, the baby's limp, feather-light weight in her arms. She had not been able to shake it. She poured herself a tin cup of water and took a slow sip. Every choice on the frontier carried a cost. This one carried more than most. Helping him once had been an act of instinct. Tomorrow, though, would be different. Tomorrow she would be choosing it, committing to a path that might change her standing with the neighbors, might bring trouble to her door. There were families in town who had lost someone to the Apache War's men, women, and even children taken in raids. People remembered those things for a lifetime. If word spread that she was aiding one, even just by nursing his child, she could find herself cut off from the fragile web of trade and support that kept her afloat. And yet, she thought of Henry again, of how she had waited by the window for him to come back from his journey west. Weeks had turned into months, and then into silence. She had felt abandoned, but she knew now what it was to be left behind with nothing but a child to care for. If the warrior's wife or whoever the baby's mother had been was gone, then he was standing where she once stood, staring down at a life that depended entirely on him. Only his burden was heavier. The child could not eat unless someone else gave from their own body. She rose and went to Samuel's cradle. He was sleeping soundly, his fist curled against his cheek. She smoothed the blanket over him, her touch gentle. He had never known hunger, not truly, and she could not stand the thought of another baby starving when she could prevent it. Her decision was already made. It had been made the moment she first saw the baby's mouth searching blindly for milk. But she still needed to name it to herself. She whispered into the quiet room, "I'll help them, as long as I'm able." The words felt like a binding. The next morning she rose before the sun. The fire was stoked, coffee brewing, and bread dough set to rise before Samuel even woke. She wanted the chores done early, leaving time for whatever the day's meeting with the Apache would bring. As the sky went from pale gray to gold, she saw him already there, waiting beneath the mesquite tree as they had agreed. The child was in his arms again, wrapped tightly, its small head resting on his shoulder. She stepped outside with Samuel on her hip and a folded blanket under her arm. The air was cooler than yesterday, a blessing, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain. Far to the south. When she reached the fence, she motioned for him to wait. Then she went back inside, laid Samuel in his cradle, and returned with a wooden chair. She set it just inside the shade of the mesquite, close enough for comfort but still on her side of the fence. The warrior stepped forward and handed her the baby. This time there was no hesitation in the exchange. His hands were steady, his gaze calm, though still wary of her every movement. She unwrapped the bundle enough to free the child's face and one tiny hand. The fingers curled against her skin like the touch of a moth's wing. She sat, opened her dress, and brought the baby to her breast. The feeding began slowly again, but soon the child's tiny body was working with urgent rhythm, drawing life from her. Eliza felt the pull not just in her body, but deep in her chest, an invisible tether tightening between herself and this little stranger. She glanced up once and found the warrior watching. His expression was unreadable, but there was a softness there she hadn't seen yesterday. When the baby had had its fill, she burped it gently, then held it against her shoulder, swaying a little as she would with Samuel. The warrior stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might say something in his own language. But instead, he simply nodded once, a nod that felt heavier than any words. She returned the baby, and this time his hand brushed hers intentionally. It was not an accident. It was a thank you, wordless but strong dot. As he turned to leave, Eliza realized her choice was no longer just a decision, it was a commitment. Tomorrow, she knew, they would meet again, and with that thought came something unexpected. She was not dreading it. The days settled into an unspoken rhythm. Each morning, just after the sun lifted over the eastern ridge, Eliza would see him waiting beneath the mesquite tree. He never approached without her nod, and he never lingered after the child had been fed. It was a rhythm as sure as the turning of the windmill blades, steady and predictable. The baby, she did not yet know whether it was a boy or girl, was gaining strength. The first mornings, the feedings had been long and slow, the little mouth clumsy with hunger. Now, the child latched quickly, drank with vigor, and sometimes even looked up at her with eyes that seemed almost curious. Eliza noticed these small changes, the way a gardener notices new buds after a long drought. She kept them to herself, though. It seemed wrong to speak them aloud, even to Samuel, who was far too young to understand. The warrior, too, seemed to be changing. At first, he had stood like a man guarding a camp alert, stiff, his eyes flicking from horizon to house. Now, he rested one hand on the fence post while she fed the child, his gaze softer, though still vigilant. Some days he would chew a strip of dried meat while waiting, offering her half when he saw she had not yet eaten. She accepted only once, not out of pride, but because she understood the value of food on the open land. Still, when she took the strip from him, their fingers brushed, and she felt the warmth of his skin, a reminder that this was not just a figure at her fence, but a man who bled, hungered, and grieved like any other. It was on the sixth morning that the air between them shifted. She had just finished feeding the baby and was smoothing the deerskin back around its tiny body when the child made a sudden, unexpected sound, a short laugh, like the bark of a puppy. Both she and the warrior froze, then looked at each other. The sound was small, but it cracked something open in the quiet morning. The warrior's lips curved, just slightly, but enough that Eliza knew it was a smile. She returned the baby, and for the first time, instead of stepping back immediately, he lingered. With one hand, he traced a pattern in the dust at his feet. A circle, then a line through it, then another smaller circle beside it. Eliza didn't understand the meaning, but the act itself felt like something like the beginning of him sharing. pieces of himself that had nothing to do with necessity. Afternoon. While Samuel napped, she sat by the window and stitched a small cloth square from an old shirt of Henry's. She did not know why she was doing it exactly, only that the baby might need something softer than the worn deerskin against its skin. Next morning, she handed it to the warrior with a small gesture toward the baby. His brows drew together in surprise. He took it, turning it over in his hands as though it were more than just a scrap of cloth. Then he nodded once slowly and tucked it inside, the wrappings around the child. That was the day she learned his name. He said it quietly, almost testing whether she would try to repeat it. The syllables were strange to her tongue, full of sounds she wasn't sure she could manage. She tried anyway. He did not laugh at her effort, only nodded again. The same deliberate nod he gave when she returned his child each morning. She told him her name in return. "Eliza," she said, pointing to herself. He repeated it once, carefully. In his mouth, it sounded softer somehow, as though the wind had smoothed its edges. It was nothing more than an exchange of names, but for Eliza, it marked a line crossed. They were no longer entirely strangers. Later that week, a storm rolled in from the south, thick and heavy with the scent of wet dust. The first drops began to fall just as she finished feeding the child. Without thinking, she motioned for the warrior to wait under her porch until the rain passed. He hesitated, then stepped forward, careful to remain near the doorway but not cross the threshold. They stood there in silence, watching the rain hammer the yard, the baby sleeping soundly in his arms. For a moment, Eliza thought of how easy it would be, in another life, for this scene to be ordinary two parents watching the rain, their children, safe inside. But the prairie was not made for such dreams. When the storm passed, he left without a word, only glancing back once. She caught the look and understood it for what it was, not gratitude, not even friendship, but recognition. They were bound now not by blood, but by the quiet work of keeping a child alive. By the second week, Eliza no longer thought of their meetings as strange. They had become part of the fabric of her mornings, like the smell of coffee or the sound of the windmill's creak. The baby, she had quietly decided, it was a boy, was stronger now. His cheeks had filled out, his eyes stayed open longer, and he often reached for her hair while nursing, his tiny fingers tangling in the loose strands. The warrior, whose name she still stumbled over, had grown less guarded. He no longer kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, but often watched her hands as she adjusted the baby or smoothed the cloth square she'd given him. Some days he would say short words in his own language while she fed the child. She guessed they were meant for the baby, but sometimes she felt they were also meant for her. It was on a quiet morning, after several days of overcast skies, that he began to tell her the baby's story, or at least as much of it as she could piece together. The ground was still damp from the last rain. Samuel was sleeping inside, giving her both hands free as she settled into the chair beneath the mesquite. She had just started to feed the boy when the warrior crouched on the other side of the fence, tracing shapes in the moist dirt with a poita stick. At first, they seemed like idle marks, but then she saw a pattern. A small square, another beside it, and a third larger one nearby. He tapped the largest square, then spread his fingers to show several people. Then he tapped the smaller one, holding up two fingers, then touching his chest. A village. His people. He made another shape, a crude outline of a mountain range, and Fodenzinge pointed north. Then he moved the stick in a zigzag line southward, tapping the baby's head when he reached the end. She understood enough. They had traveled far. Very far. Then his gestures slowed. He drew a shape like a circle with rays around it. She guessed it meant the sun, and held up 3 fingers. 3 days? Or maybe 3 months? She couldn't be certain. But when he mimed lying still, eyes. closed his hand over his chest. She knew what it meant. The mother. Gone. He didn't look at her as he made the gesture. His eyes stayed on the dirt, the stick in his hand trembling slightly. Then he mimed holding the baby, rocking him, and pointed. To himself, alone. Eliza felt her throat tighten. She thought of her own nights alone after Henry vanished, holding Samuel in the dark, listening to the wind in the walls, wondering how long she could keep going. But at least she had food, shelter, and the knowledge that her neighbors, though distant, were there if she called. For him, there had been nothing but the open land and the need to keep moving. He continued the story with more gestures, pointing to his mouth, then shaking his head, miming the act of carrying a heavy weight, showing the arc of the sun again and again as though counting the days. She realized he was telling her how long the boy had gone without proper milk before they reached her. No wonder the child had been so weak. When she looked up at him, his eyes met hers at last. They were dark and deep-set, but not hard. There was a tiredness in them, yes, but also something steadier, something like resolve. She wished she could tell him she understood, that she honored what he had done to get here. But she only nodded, hoping that was enough. The baby stirred and released her breast, his face drowsy but content. She wrapped him again and carried him to the fence. This time, when she handed the child back, the warrior rested his palm briefly over hers, their hands pressed together with the boy between them. It wasn't just thanks. It was the closing of a story he had carried alone until now. When he stepped back, she saw that his mouth had tightened again, but his eyes, they had softened. The story had been told, even without words. And now she carried part of it with her. That night, as she rocked Samuel to sleep, she thought about what he had risked, not just the journey, but coming here at all. It would have been easier for him to take what he needed by force. But instead, he had chosen to ask. And she realized, with a strange pang, that trust once given was as binding as any blood tie. By the third week, the routine between them had deepened into something that felt almost natural. Eliza would wait before dawn, tend the fire, and set out a small cloth bundle with a bit of bread or dried apple. It wasn't part of their arrangement. Not exactly. He had never asked for food, but she'd noticed how his shoulders seemed less tense when he accepted it. In return, he sometimes brought her things: a handful of mesquite beans, a strip of smoked rabbit, once even a tightly woven reed basket small enough to sit in her palm. They never exchanged more than a few words, yet each gift was its own conversation. Baby was thriving now. His cheeks had taken on a healthy roundness, and his eyes followed movement with a sharpness Eliza hadn't seen before. Sometimes, while Samuel napped inside, she would hold both boys at once, the Apache child feeding on one side, Samuel squirming and fussing on the other, feeling a strange, fierce satisfaction that she could keep two lives going with her own strength. One morning, as she rocked the baby under the mesquite's shade, the warrior stepped closer than usual to watch. The early light touched his face, and for the first time, she saw the hint of a scar just above his jawline, faded but deep. It looked old, the kind earned in battle. She wondered how many fights he had survived before finding himself here, waiting by her fence each morning. The wind was soft that day, carrying the faint scent of sage from somewhere far off. After the boy had fed and drifted to sleep, Eliza hesitated before handing him back. She smoothed the folds of the deerskin, making sure the cloth square she'd sewn was still tucked near his chest. When she finally looked up, the warrior's gaze was steady on her. Something passed between them then, not gratitude exactly, but recognition. They both understood that this wasn't just about milk anymore. It was about the small trust they'd built in a world where trust was rarely given. That trust began to show itself in unexpected ways. One afternoon, Eliza was returning from the well when she spotted movement on the horizon, a lone rider approaching. At a pace too slow for trouble but too steady to ignore. She wasn't expecting visitors. She tucked Samuel inside, slipped the rifle from its hooks, and stepped onto the porch. The rider turned out to be one of her neighbors, Mr. Talbot, bringing word of a broken fence line near the creek. He lingered longer than she liked, his gaze scanning her yard as though looking for something. It wasn't until after he'd gone that she noticed the faint movement in the tall grass near the mesquite. The warrior was there, half hidden, watching. He had stayed out of sight but close enough to see if she needed help. She didn't know whether to feel comforted or unsettled. In the end, she chose comfort. From then on, she began leaving a tin cup by the well each morning. Sometimes when she went out later, it would be gone, and in its place she'd find something small, a smooth stone, a sprig of desert marigold, a feather striped in black and white. It was a silent game of give and take, and she found herself looking forward to it, but the bond showed itself most clearly in the way the baby reacted to her. Some mornings, when the warrior arrived, the child would reach toward her before she had even taken him. His eyes would widen, his little mouth working in anticipation. Eliza knew the sound of that hunger cry as well as she knew Samuel's, and it stirred something deep in her, something almost maternal. One morning, when she returned the baby after a feeding, the warrior did not step back immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, then touched two fingers to his own chest and said something in Apache, a short phrase, the meaning of which she could not guess. He repeated it softly to the baby, then to her again. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the kind of tone a man used when marking someone as important. That night, lying in bed with Samuel breathing softly beside her, Eliza thought about how unlikely it all was. A white homesteader woman and an Apache warrior bound by nothing but a child's need. Yet day by day, the fear and mistrust that had seemed so natural at first had given way to something far more dangerous to the walls people built around themselves. Respect. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew she would. Keep walking it for the baby's sake, and maybe, just a little, for his word on the prairie was like wind, it traveled unseen, carrying dust and rumors with equal speed. It began with a glance. One morning, while Eliza was in town trading eggs for flour, she caught Mrs. Talbot watching her from the steps of the general store. The woman's gaze wasn't exactly hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It lingered too long, assessing. Then came the questions, casual at first. Mr. Finch, the storekeeper, asked if she'd had any trouble with strays near her place. She knew he didn't mean livestock. The next week, as she tied her wagon outside the mercantile, she overheard two men talking near the blacksmith's shop. Carter Place, east of the creek. They say an Apache's been hanging round. That so? I heard he's got a squaw and kid hiding in the hills. Well, she ought to be careful. Folks get nervous when they see that kind of thing. Eliza didn't interrupt them. She just kept her eyes on the sacks of feed in the wagon bed, her hand steady even though her heart was not. By the time she returned home that day, she found herself scanning the horizon in a different way. The warrior was still there under the mesquite, holding the child. He looked the same as always, but now she was aware of how visible he was to anyone passing through the area. The next morning, before he could approach, she held up her hand. He stopped at the fence, confusion flickering across his face. She stepped closer, her voice low. You have to come from the south now, she said, gesturing in the direction of the dry wash that would hide his approach from the road. Then she pointed to her own eyes, then toward the horizon. Others are watching. He studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. The next day and every day after, he came from the south. But even with precautions, the tension seeped in. One afternoon, Mr. Talbot himself rode up to her porch. His horse's hooves stirred the dry earth into pale clouds. "Just checking in," he said, too casually. "Heard there's been an Apache seen in these parts. You seen anything?" Eliza met his gaze evenly. "No more than you have." Which was true enough. Talbot had probably seen him from a distance, the way the others had. But she kept her face smooth, her voice even. Talbot didn't press. But as he turned his horse, he gave her yard one last long look, the kind that didn't need words to carry its meaning. That night, she didn't sleep well. She kept thinking of how easy it would be for a story true or not to turn dangerous. All it would take was one person deciding she was helping an enemy. The next morning, when the warrior arrived, she handed him the baby quickly and motioned for him to keep low under the tree. She could feel the watchfulness in him to his eyes. Scanned the horizon more often, his movements more careful. The baby fed well that day, his small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. She looked down at him and felt a sudden fierce anger. This child didn't understand the lines drawn between people here. He only understood hunger and comfort. When she returned him to his father, she placed a small bundle of cornbread in his free hand. "For the road," she said, though she knew he couldn't understand the words. He paused, studying her face as if trying to read what she wasn't saying. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lifted his hand to his chest and gave a short bow. Of his head dot, it wasn't until he disappeared toward the wash that Eliza realized something. She wasn't afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid for them. It was just after dawn when Eliza saw them. She had stepped out onto the porch with Samuel balanced on her hip, expecting to find the warrior alone beneath the mesquite. Instead, there were 3 figures, 2 men on horseback and 1 woman standing. Beside them, her dark hair plaited in a single braid that fell nearly to her waist. The warrior was there, holding the baby, speaking low to the others. When he glanced toward Eliza's house, their eyes met across the stretch of dusty ground. Her heart gave a small, hard twist. She didn't need words to understand. These were his kin. They had come for him. She set Samuel in his cradle, then stepped down from the porch and walked toward the fence. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the prairie itself knew this was a morning for partings. The woman approached first, her gaze steady but not unkind. She spoke in the Apache tongue, her voice low and measured. Eliza couldn't follow the meaning, but the tone was unmistakable. Gratitude. Then the warrior came forward, the baby in his arms. Eliza took him almost without thinking, feeling the familiar weight, the warmth of his small body. The boy looked stronger than ever now, his cheeks full, his eyes bright. She smoothed the cloth square she'd sewn, still tucked near his chest. After all these weeks, for a moment, she almost forgot there was an ending here. But when the warrior reached into the leather pouch at his side, reality returned. He drew out something small, a necklace of bone beads, strung with care, each piece carved and polished until it gleamed in the morning light. At its center hung a single turquoise stone, no bigger than her thumbnail. He held it in both hands, then extended it to her. His eyes didn't leave hers as she accepted it. She turned it over in her palm. It was warm from his touch. The beads were worn smooth. The turquoise cracked faintly in one corner. This was no trinket made in haste. It had lived a life before it came to her. "I can't," she began, then stopped. The words were useless. He wouldn't understand them. But when she started to offer it back, he shook his head. Instead, he touched his chest, then hers, then the baby's. A circle closed. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything that could hold the weight of these weeks, of the silent trust they had built. But there were no words in any language that could do that. The warrior stepped back then, and the woman came to take the baby. Eliza let him go slowly, her fingers lingering a moment on the small hand that had so often curled into her dress. The boy made a small sound, almost a whimper, but then nestled against the woman's shoulder without fuss. The three of them mounted their horses. The warrior lingered a moment longer on the ground, looking at her with that same steady gaze he had worn the very first morning, but now it held something else too. Not just need, not just respect, something closer to kinship. He gave one final nod, then turned to follow the others. Eliza stood by the fence, the necklace clutched in her hand, watching until they became no more than moving shapes on the horizon. The sun was climbing higher, now burning away the shadows, and soon there was only the empty sweep of land between her and the distance. She walked back to the house slowly. Samuel was still sleeping, the morning light just beginning to touch his curls. She sat beside his cradle and held the necklace in her palm, tracing the shape of the turquoise with her thumb. It felt strange to have her arms empty of that other child, the one she had never named but had known as closely as her own. Stranger still to think she might never see him again, but deep down, she suspected she would. It was the spring rains that brought him back. Eliza was out in the yard, scattering seed for the hens, when she noticed a lone rider on the trail beyond the creek. At first, she thought it was one of the Talbot boys, same easy seat in the saddle, same unhurried pace. But as he drew closer, she saw the rider was younger, slighter, and dressed in Apache clothing trimmed with bright beadwork. He dismounted at the fence and stood there for a moment, as though measuring whether to approach. The wind lifted his hair, and the sun caught on something at his throat, a small flash of blue-green. Her breath caught. It was the turquoise stone, the same one the warrior had given her years before, now strung on a leather cord that hung against the boy's chest. She crossed the yard slowly, her pulse quickening. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. His features were sharp with youth, but there was no mistaking the eyes, bright, watchful, carrying the same quiet depth she had seen in his father. When she reached the fence, he spoke a few words in Apache. She didn't understand them, but his voice was steady, his tone respectful. Then he touched the turquoise at his throat, and with a small smile, reached into his SECERT. What he brought out made her heart give a strange, hard lurch. It was the cloth square she had sewn all those years ago, a simple bit of fabric, worn soft from time. She had tucked it near his chest when he was an infant, thinking of comfort more than memory. Yet here it was, carried back to her after all this time. He held it out to her, and she took it gently, her fingers brushing his. "You've grown," she said softly, knowing he couldn't understand the words but feeling the truth of them just the same. For a while they stood in companionable silence. She offered him water from the well, and he drank, glancing around the yard as if seeing pieces of his own history. She imagined he was recalling the porch, the mesquite tree, the mornings of warmth and milk and song he couldn't possibly remember but might have been told about. When he finished, he reached for something else in his satchel, a bundle wrapped in deerskin. He placed it in her hands. Inside was a string of new beads, bright and smooth, with a larger turquoise stone at the center. It was the same color as the one she already wore, but uncracked, untouched by time. She fastened it around her neck while he watched, and when she was done, she placed her hand over it, just as his father had done years ago. The boy smiled, not wide, but warm, the kind of smile that carried recognition. He didn't linger long. The world had changed since those first visits with his father, and both of them knew that some bonds, though deep, must remain quiet. But before he mounted his horse, he stepped forward and, with the same deliberate care his father had shown, touched his chest, then hers, then the turquoise. A circle closed again. She watched him ride away until the distance swallowed him, the echo of hoofbeats fading into the hum of spring insects. Around her neck, the new beads felt both heavy and comforting. In her palm, the worn cloth square seemed impossibly small. That night, After Samuel, now nearly a man himself, had gone to bed, Eliza sat by the fire, the old necklace in her lap, the new one still warm against her skin. She thought about the unlikely chain of moments that had brought them here, a warrior at her fence, a baby's cry, the quiet days of trust built without words. She realized then that motherhood was not always bound by blood, nor even by time. Sometimes it was carried in small, enduring acts, a feeding under a mesquite tree, a gift pressed into a hand, a memory passed on until it outlived the ones who made it. Somewhere out there, under the same night sky, that boy was riding home. And whether he knew it or not, he carried a part of her with him, just as she carried a part of him. Name, perhaps, but in spirit, always.